October 14, 1871. Journal and Argus, Petaluma, California. The Chicago Conflagration. Since the telegraph spread the news of the assassination of President Lincoln through the land, no telegrams have attracted so much attention and elicited so much interest as those relating to the destruction of Chicago by a conflagration. In the annals of the country, there is no record of so terrible a catastrophe, and the disaster is probably unparalleled in the recent chronicles of Europe. It is almost impossible to believe, in this era of telegraphic fire alarms, steam fire engines with their improved apparatus and efficient management, with the great attention to fireproof armor for buildings, that a city possessing all these should be swept away in one fiery breath. But such a fate has overtaken Chicago. In a few decades, she had placed herself foremost among American cities. A week ago, she presented more completely than any other community the enterprise and pluck which we are taught to consider American characteristics. She was the emporium of the Great West. Possessing great wealth, she had become a seat of refinement and art. Expensive public and private buildings were scattered over the area, now in ashes, and some of her thoroughfares were unsurpassed for beauty and elegance. Her public works were on a scale equal to her prosperity. Her railroad depots, hotels, theaters, etc., were spacious and costly, while innumerable monuments attested the sagacity and enterprise of her businessmen. Secure in her splendid prosperity, among the solid communities, she was the most substantial. Today, of a population of 300,000, one half are homeless and destitute, wandering among embers and ashes in a vain search for their household lares. Many have met tragic deaths amid the horrors of the conflagration, and the most fortunate among the survivors have suffered losses requiring many years of industry to replace. Though the disaster falls most heavy upon the destitute poor, it bears with great weight upon capitalists and the minor moneyed class in the suspension of business and the depreciation of real estate and telegraph, railroad, insurance, gas, water, and other stocks. It is not possible to state definitely what portions of the city escaped the flames or to estimate the damages sustained. The loss has been put at $160 million, an amount whose magnitude is not so easily appreciated. A portion of this sum was covered by insurance, but owners of property in the burned district find that policies in local companies are worthless, and the condition of outside companies is being closely scrutinized. Limited space prevents our giving more than a synopsis of the Associated Press dispatches. 2 conflagrations occurred, the first one being comparatively unimportant. At 10 o'clock on Saturday night, a fire broke out in the southern part of the city in a region of lumber and coal yards and small wooden tenements. The light breeze blowing at the time swelled to a gale, rendering the efforts of the firemen ineffectual. The fire raged until 2 o'clock Sunday morning, burning over 6 blocks and destroying property worth $500,000. The second alarm was sounded at 9:45 Sunday night, at a point distant 2.5 miles from the courthouse. The wind had risen to a perfect gale, and the firemen, worn out by their previous labors, were incapable of making a successful resistance to the advancing flames. At 2 o'clock Monday morning, the flames had spread with great rapidity, assisted by the furious gale, having progressed more than a mile in 3 hours. The fire had gained such headway that the most thorough-built, fireproof buildings offered no resistance at all, but melted before the furious heat. The heat was so intense that bricks, stones, and iron were fused into masses. The Nicholson pavements were burned out of the streets. Water and gas pipes were destroyed, and, at one time, the water and gas works were seriously threatened. The hotels, railroad depots, post office, customs house, courthouse, churches, and other public buildings had disappeared. To add to the terrors of the situation, the water gave out, and the firemen ceased operations from exhaustion. Fire engines arrived from Milwaukee, Cincinnati, and other points, but their efforts seemed availless to stay the flames. Chicago, October 9, 1:15 a.m. The fire is still raging and with increased fury. It has spread almost with the velocity of the wind and has now reached West Monroe Street, a distance of more than a mile from where it started, and it covers a breadth of nearly half a mile, reaching from the river to Jefferson Street. The district burned over involves an immense number of lumber yards, the freight depots of the Chicago, St. Louis, and Pittsburgh, Fort Wayne, and Chicago railroads. The task of arresting it seems fourfold greater than it did an hour ago. The following prominent buildings are destroyed: the Great Pacific Hotel, Post Office, Custom House, and Courthouse. The Nicholson pavements in the principal streets are burned, and the heat is so intense that the fire cannot be approached. At noon, the waterworks were burned, and hardly a drop of water was to be had. The fire is all over the city, north, south, east, and west, covering an area 3 1/2 miles in length by 1 1/4 in width. Over 400 entire blocks and 6,000 houses were destroyed. It is stated that 100 people were burned upon a bridge. The draw was raised to give passage to a vessel, and the flames swept down upon the crowd, who were thus hemmed. Numbers took to the river and found a watery grave. The prisoners confined in the courthouse were forgotten and are supposed to have been burned or blown up, as a large quantity of powder was stored there. Insurance policies are worth nothing. A man offered a $2,500 policy for a week's board, and then for a cup of coffee, but both were refused. No one has saved any quantity of their effects. Wealthy merchants opened their stores to the poor, telling them to help themselves, and the streets are thronged with men, women, and children laden with dry goods, groceries, and all imaginable articles. There are no means of removing merchandise or other articles, vehicles being at a premium. Express wagons charge $15 a load, and hackmen charge $10 a mile. The progress of the flames was arrested at 1:00 p.m. This was accomplished by blowing up and demolishing buildings in the path of the flames, which was done by order of Lieutenant General Sheridan. The governor, the mayor, General Sheridan, and the committee of citizens are actively engaged in providing for the suffering and destitute. Churches, schoolhouses, and private residences are offering shelter to the homeless. Large tents have been pitched, accommodating a great number of persons. Supplies of clothing and food are arriving by carloads, and munificent donations of money are being made from all quarters. The railroads are running into the city, carrying supplies free, and taking away such as wish to leave the scene of the disaster. Preparations are being made to rebuild, one order for 250,000 brick having been made. October 21, 1871, the Bayonne Herald, Bayonne City, New Jersey. After a great fire. Says a correspondent writing from Chicago, "Never was presented a more mournful scene as last night I walked through the desolate ruins of the South Division of this city. In my front and on my left were lurid flames rising from the great beds of coal along the banks of the river, and here and there among the ruins were little patches of flames, blue or red, where apparently solid granite and brick were yet ablaze. From all these flames arose a baneful light that dragged the ruins from the shadows of the night and made every ragged remnant of a wall seem a monument of general desolation. And these remnants were by no means few. Stout walls of granite had been blistered and cracked by the fierce heat, but portions of many yet stood erect amid the ruins. As far as the eye could reach on every side, in the red light of the distant coal fields, was a chaos of smoldering fire. In the silence and solitude came a sense of desolation no other ruins could cause. If the ruins are weirdly grand by night, it is only by day that a correct idea of the destruction which has been wrought can be obtained. The strong light of day enables the eye to reach for miles on every side, only to view the wreck of what last week was a busy hive of commerce. Imagine an area of 2,500 acres covered with heaps of bricks and ashes, with here and there the remnants of a wall yet erect, to tell more plainly the story of destruction. An area 4 miles long by an average of 3/4 of a mile wide, with not a house left standing. In this space was the bulk of the wealth which Chicago had accumulated. Stately buildings, devoted to commerce, art, literature, and religion, covered a part of this territory. Never was wreck so complete. There is an amusing absence of debris, for the fire seems to have literally swallowed all these huge houses, leaving nothing behind but heaps of ashes and a few scraps of iron. I had expected to find the streets encumbered with huge masses of bricks, iron, and other refuse, but found them almost entirely clear, and nowhere so blocked as to be impassable for vehicles. It seemed as if the fire devoured the building so rapidly that only insignificant fragments fell to the ground, and I can readily believe the statement that the flames spread from block to block faster than a man could walk. But complete as is the destruction in the South Division, it is as nothing compared with that in the North Division. There, with one exception, everything is leveled even with the streets. Not a timber remains, nor one single brick in its place. The one exception is another marvel of this great conflagration, as it is a frame house that was in the midst of the fire, and yet it is scarcely touched. Origin of the Chicago Fire. A Chicago letter gives the following story of the origin of the fire which destroyed the city. And now for the origin of the fire. At 9:10 o'clock on Sunday evening, flames broke out in a small barn near the corner of Farquhar and Jefferson Streets on the west side. The premises were owned by an old Irish woman. For several years, she was a pensioner on the bounty of the county. The relief agent helped her because her appearance indicated great poverty. About 1 year ago, it was accidentally discovered she was the owner of 6 milch cows. Then the agent refused to assist her further. She was in the habit of visiting her cows every evening. On Saturday night, she took the lamp in her hand and went out in the barn. Then, she wanted some salt from the house, and she set the lamp down to go after it. A moment later, and the barn was in flames. The heavy wind drove it from house to house, and soon the carnival had commenced. Towards the north crept the fire swiftly and surely. From Jefferson Street to the river just 3 blocks, and from Farquhar to Van Buren was 7 blocks. Not a dozen houses were left standing. Grain elevators, railroad roundhouses, manufactories, churches, and residences went down. The only house left standing on the block where the fire first broke out was the one occupied by the old Irish woman. On yesterday afternoon, she sat on her front doorstep, moaning bitterly because the fire had burned up her cows. She was too ignorant to understand what a calamity had overtaken the proud city of the West through her own carelessness. The fire thus kindled extended northward in the next division until it reached the district made desolate on Saturday night. Here 4 blocks of buildings had already been destroyed. There was nothing for the fiend to feed upon except one huge elevator, and that was soon destroyed. Then the flames leaped across the street, falling near the South Side gasworks, and thence spread in every direction.